Western Sydney already has a problem with extreme heat, and this will only get worse with global warming, which will increase the frequency and harshness of extreme heat events. The Australia Institute's HeatWatch initiative today is launching its Western Sydney report. Using CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology data, we show that extreme heat in Western Sydney, so days over 35 degrees, will increase up to fivefold, from a historical average of 11 days per year up to 52 by 2090. That's a fivefold increase in extreme heat days over the next 70 years. In some locations in Western Sydney, like in Richmond, you could see this increase up to 67 days per year of extreme heat by 2090. That's almost 2 months of the year in Richmond that'll be over 35 degrees every day. This is a serious threat for the health and well-being of Western Sydney siders. Heat waves already kill more people than all other natural disasters in Australia. This has serious implications for essential infrastructure, with extreme heat damaging roads, buckling rail lines, and causing further disruptions to commuting and travel times. In New South Wales, which is highly reliant on old coal-fired power stations, heat waves regularly cause breakdowns and increase the likelihood of blackouts. Our heat wave initiative is showing the same worrying trend right across the country. In Queensland today, we have an unprecedented heat wave. These are some of the impacts of climate change, but it's not inevitable. CSIRO projections show that with serious and collective action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that we can avoid most of these dangerous increases in extreme heat events. Thanks.
I'm Kean-Sen Lim. I'm the president of AMA New South Wales. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and on which we gather and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. So I've been a GP in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney for almost 25 years. And geographically, this part of Sydney lies in a small dip in elevation with the mountains to the west of us. Once upon a time, this was an area which was filled with market gardens and farmlands and vineyards, but it's now increasingly filled with high-rise apartment blocks, and the concrete there acts like a huge heat sink in summer and with little airflow through this time. So it's not uncommon, especially in summer, to find the temperatures out in Western Sydney 10 degrees or more higher than it is in the city. The cost of electricity rises every year, year on year. My patients in Mount Druitt are generally less well off financially, and many will try to save on their electricity bills by reducing their cooling and heating costs. About a third of my patients have diabetes or pre-diabetes. 15% of my patients in my practice have diabetes, and about a third of this number have heart failure in one form or another. The medications that we put them on will often make it harder for them to control their body temperature. Very frequently, these same patients are also on water restrictions or fluid restrictions, as well as on fluid tablets. And one of the main ways that our body controls its heat and temperature is through sweating and evaporation. If you are dehydrated or on certain medications which reduce your capacity to do this, then this becomes a big problem. And in summer especially, we find we have enormous problems trying to stabilize some of our patients with heart failure. And one of the biggest causes of admissions to hospitals in Western Sydney is heart failure. And this is one of the rising costs that we see. Climate change is a problem. And the figures presented today show us that this is going to be an increasing problem into the future unless we act upon it now. There is significant research showing that higher than average temperatures and heat waves contribute to health conditions and increases in deaths. Even climate change deniers are unable to dispute the link between hot weather and risk of bushfires. Heat waves are Australia's most deadly natural disaster, killing more people than bushfires, floods and cyclones put together. And these are especially deadly to people over the age of 65. It's not just the elderly at risk. The negative health impacts and increase in deaths from climate change are not evenly distributed. Poorer people, children, and those with pre-existing medical conditions are at higher risk and are more vulnerable to heat stress than many of us here today. Ultimately, the facts are we have seen an increase in the average surface air temperature in Australia since records began in 1910. Human-generated greenhouse gas emissions have a 95% or higher likelihood of being the dominant cause of this climate change, and we project further increases in this climate change over the years between now and 2030 and even through to 2090, with rises in the total number of days above 35 degrees in Western Sydney. The significance of this cannot be understated. There are reasons why it's important for AMA and doctors for the environment and doctors overall to be broadly involved in this area and advocating in this space. Quality healthcare comes in many forms, and it doesn't always look like surgery, vaccines, or broken bones. As a doctor, particularly as a general practitioner, preventative healthcare is one of the most important contributions that I and we can make to the health of our community. As the AMA New South Wales President, that community is a bit bigger than that I serve in Mount Druitt. Climate change presents a very significant threat to the ongoing health of people everywhere, but it's easy to dismiss or put it in the too hard basket. Climate change has to be on the agenda. Inaction is costing us. As an association, we would like to and we need to see climate change firmly back on the political agenda. Thank you.
Hello, my name's David Hill. I'm the CEO of an organisation out in Parramatta. We're very concerned when we hear numbers like 12 days on average a year above 40 degrees. This has a serious and significant impact on business, how we do business and how we plan for the future. Some of the kind of basic things that happen is some organisations that don't have air conditioning need to close down. If you're a distribution centre or if you're an organisation that actually is a school, for example, then maybe you've got to start sending kids home. But let's talk a little bit about what happens when you get temperatures above 40 degrees and you get rail lines buckling and you get air conditioning no longer working because the power goes out. In that circumstance, we get some real issues. We get people that are stuck inside high-rise buildings. Parramatta is a really interesting place. It's a place which is about to triple the amount of residences in Parramatta. This is in one part of Sydney which has a much higher degree of risk when it comes to things like environmental issues. We also have a massive intensification of what's happening inside the commercial world. This is all happening inside the western part of Sydney. If the jobs are in Sydney, in the eastern suburbs, then why are we putting all of the new residences in the west? That doesn't make any sense to us. And why are we developing at such an incredibly fast rate? So some of the kind of things that are happening in Parramatta at the moment are, of course, the new light rail. We've got $7 billion worth of investment. On the surface, really wonderful. But what's actually happening, of course, is a large amount of displacement of existing businesses and displacement of existing residences. This is causing some serious issues, not just for individuals, but also for what's happening for our city. We also see at the same time decisions being made from Sydney about what should be happening in Parramatta. One station for a very large city doesn't make a great deal of sense. The new Western rail link doesn't link to Parramatta, and yet that's where the workers from those areas are coming into Parramatta to work. We really need a much better level of planning at the moment to improve things. Let's talk for a moment a bit about what business should be doing. So in the short term, of course, we should be planning. Planning is really important, looking at risks, factoring that into what we do for the future. Critically important. Then let's talk about what business should be doing in terms of the big picture. Well, we should be lobbying. We should be lobbying to make sure that the government actually takes Paris seriously, that we as a business community do our bit. And the government should do its bit. It's not good that Australia's not seen to do its bit on an international stage. We're just a group of businesses in Parramatta, but we are trying a few things. We're starting a business environment expo where we talk about energy, water and waste. It's practical, it's not driven by government, it's driven by our own local chamber, and we're doing our bit to kind of make a difference, businesses working with businesses. Let's hope things do change.
Good morning, my name's Charles Casuscelli. I represent 8 of the Western Sydney councils who are very concerned about the effects of extreme heat events and of heat waves in Western Sydney. Unfortunately, it's an area that suffers the most from these things, but the reality is it's not just Western Sydney, it's greater Western Sydney. You know, an area from the Hawkesbury down to Campbelltown and Wallandilly out to Lithgow that are very concerned about the extreme heat events and heat waves in general because the well-being of its communities are at risk. For people of Western Sydney, extreme heat and heat waves is not an issue of comfort or discomfort. It's an issue of life and death. It's an issue of survivability. It's an issue that affects our vulnerable communities, those that have health issues or those that are financially disadvantaged. These are the people that in the future, unless we do something about the extreme heat and the heat waves that are occurring in Western Sydney that are projected to increase, the mortality and morbidity rates associated with these vulnerable communities will increase. And they don't need to increase if we actually take action now. Local government is best placed to make sure that things happen in our communities. They're at the level of government closest to our communities. They have an influence on how we design and plan our neighbourhoods and our precincts. They have an influence on how we design our buildings. They have an influence on how and where and how many trees we plant, how much vegetation we plant in our communities. They have an influence on how we use water. These are the things that will make a dramatic difference in our communities in Western Sydney. And local government, through its councils, understands that a more sophisticated and a more coordinated approach to urban heat is required. And that is why, like the Australia Institute, we've done significant research in what we as local government can do. We've developed an urban heat mitigation strategy. It's a framework, if you like, and it really empowers and coordinates local government action to make sure that we act on the sorts of findings that the Australia Institute has found through its significant research to date. Local government is ready and willing, and in fact I commend all councils of Greater Western Sydney because it was they that first brought up the issue of urban heat that actually found its way into the Greater Sydney Commission's plans for our future in terms of the Sydney Region Plan and the district plans that support it. I think that the issue of urban heat now has made it not only into those documents but is being talked about throughout 3 levels of government as to what sort of action we can actually undertake to mitigate its effects on our communities into the future. Thank you.
Great.
Since we got you here first, might as well ask. Were the findings shocking to see, or being a person who is from there, were they expected?
Look, the Australia Institute's actually validated some research that we had done as well, working with the University of New South Wales, that actually pointed out that the number of people that die from heat-related causes were greater than the combined effects of all the other natural disasters that before Australia. So no, they weren't surprising for people within local government who's actually been working at this for quite some time. What is surprising is the sheer number of people that could potentially have premature deaths between now and over the next 20 or 40 or 50 years unless we take some definitive action right now.
Just first of all, do you mind elaborating on what impact these increases in temperature could have on Sydney's ageing population out in the west?
So one of the problems with being out in the west is that the temperature extremes are more extreme. One of the other problems we have, especially in areas like Mount Druitt, is the lower capacity to pay for better housing and or in fact just simple air conditioning to try to keep the temperature down. Now, one of the issues we have, especially out in our area in Western Sydney, is larger numbers of people with diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, and often they are more badly affected by heat and have a lower or poorer capacity to be actually able to manage heat stress themselves. And this puts them at risk of hospitalization, at risk of destabilization of their health problems, and this ends up costing the whole system more money.
Do you have numbers of how many elderly people were treated, I guess, last year for heat, and how did that number increase?
Sure. So figures we've seen from New South Wales Health from last year show that in times of extreme heat, there's actually an increase of up to 10% more in admissions and deaths, which are directly attributable to the heat events.
Is it just the elderly who are affected, or young children, or people with diseases?
So heat affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. those who are older, those who have chronic diseases, and certainly those who are very young are more likely to be badly affected and are more likely to be worse affected.
So, solution. So it would be cutting emissions, you would say?
Yeah, that's right. Look, if we want to avoid these rises in extreme heats, according to CSIRO projections, there's a way to do it, and that's seriously reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. That's in Australia and also taking a leadership role globally. And for Australia, the largest emissions can be located in our energy sector. So switching from coal-fired power, which is highly reliant in New South Wales, to renewables and storage would be one of the biggest ways that we could reduce our national emissions.
So would that be something that the federal government or the state government should spearhead?
Both have a role to play. So the New South Wales government can look at adopting a renewable energy target here, much like they have in Queensland or Victoria or in the ACT. But then federally, then there needs to be leadership shown as well as to how we transition the entire grid, given it crosses about 5 states.
And is that something that you guys are calling for in the lead up to both a state and a federal election?
Yeah. Both the state and federal governments have a role to play in transitioning our energy sector. The transition is happening anyway, and there's a leadership role that needs to be shown by both governments in making sure that it meets the needs of our society in terms of reliability, that it is affordable, but most importantly, that we also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
And of course, there's the population who believe climate change isn't a thing, who probably wouldn't believe these figures. What could you say to them?
The Australian Institute surveyed the entire country under the Climate of the Nation survey earlier this year and found that 3/4 of the population are seriously concerned with climate change and want the government to play a leadership role. So the science is clear and the actions that we need to take are also clear. All we're missing now is the political will.